Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. For those of you that don't know, the Seattle 2030 District is a environmental nonprofit made up of property owners, property managers, architects, engineers, contractors, all who have decided to try to hit a goal of reducing their energy, water, and transportation emissions by 50% by the year 2030. We're one of 23 2030 districts across North America in places like Pittsburgh, and Detroit, New York, Dallas, Toronto, and I always got to remember to say our Canadian 2030 districts as well. But we're just really pleased to have you all here and to be talking about energy efficient financing and CPACER. This is a really interesting opportunity for people to engage with financing some of these projects. So I hope you can submit questions. We'll be coming around to get those and making sure that we can do that. And I'll pass it along to Steve to introduce our speakers for today.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. So our speaker, we have two amazing speakers with a lot of experience here in energy efficiency financing, and specifically with CPACER. So Rachel Brombaugh is the Washington State Managing Director for PACE Equity LLC. And PACE Equity is a national leader in commercial PACE financing. Before joining PACE, Rachel was the Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives for King County Executive Doug Constantine, leading a broad suite of policies and programs to reduce emissions, lead with climate justice, and prepare communities for the impacts of climate change. In this role, Rachel developed and administered the King County CPACER program, which enabled $40 million of investment in its first 6 months. A longtime advocate for a low-carbon economy in the Pacific Northwest, Rachel has been active in policy at the state and local level and has served on the boards of Spark Northwest and the Seattle 2030 District. John Kennedy attended grad school at the Evans School of Public Policy, where he studied energy markets and finance. After that, he launched a climate communications and community organizing nonprofit called the 2050 Project. His team worked with King County to produce a 6-part video series about CPACER and its connection to the Washington Clean Building Performance Standard. In 2022, John joined Kitsap Bank as a Climate Core Fellow and helped the specialty and municipal banking team develop a CPACER product. He is also currently employed at Jefferson County as a CPACER specialist and is assisting the Department of Community Development with their 2023 CPACER program launch. So I think with that, we've got a few questions for the panelists, and we'll go through with about 5 or 6 questions. Take about an hour, and then we'll have the opportunity for some audience questions. Like Sheila said, there's an opportunity. You can either write those down and pass them to Sheila. We also have some online attendees, and so she'll be curating those from the chat. For any of the online attendees, please go ahead and submit your questions in chat, and Sheila will bring those forward. If you have a question you want to share with the panelists after we open the Q&A session, you can walk up. There's a meeting owl here in the middle of the room, and that way we'll enable that mic so the online audience can hear you as well. So with that, let me go ahead and say welcome. Panelists, can we start, Rachel, what is PACE financing and how does it work? Can you explain it to a building owner?
I hope so. Anyway, thanks for having us, and thanks for everyone here coming in tonight. So PACE is an acronym for Property Assessed Clean Energy. And what it is a public-private financing mechanism that building owners and developers for new construction can use to lower their cost of capital and finance components of the building that have to do with energy efficiency, renewable energy, and in Washington State resiliency. And so what that means is that a building owner can finance the HVAC, the mechanical, the envelope, the electrical, any kind of seismic retrofit with PACE financing. And the public part is that the county or the enabling jurisdiction allows the private part, which would be lenders like myself and Kitsap Bank, to place an assessment on the property in exchange for lending. And the reason they do that is that these items that we're lending on or lending for have a public good. They reduce energy use, they reduce carbon, they provide community resiliency or building resiliency. So that's the trade-off there. That's why there's a public-private partnership in the county or other jurisdiction, depends on where you are, is related. So in short, it really is, it's a win-win. It allows building owners to save money through a lower cost of capital because we can replace equity or mezzanine debt, which is higher interest rate debt than bank debt. And then we can also incent the high performance of new buildings or incent retrofits with by reducing that barrier to access to capital.
Thank you. And John, do you want to talk a little bit more about PACE from your side, and maybe a little bit more about the implementation Washington State line?
Yeah, so okay, it's a great fit, as she was saying, for energy upgrades in the built environment because it can be extended for a lengthy period of time, up to 30 years. So it corresponds with the useful life of the asset, which is why it's the ideal financing mechanism for all things energy and resiliency. And in Washington, House Bill 2405 passed in 2020, enabling CPACE financing in Washington. But also that year, you may recall, COVID reared its ugly head, and the state determined that it might not have the fiscal capacity to manage a statewide program. So counties were told to pass an ordinance and launch their own programs. I believe 7 counties so far have an active program in place. 2 more are developing a program, but that leaves 30 who aren't making any progress at all, to my knowledge. And that is a problem, hopefully one that gets remedied sooner rather than later. I think the amount of activity so far has been pretty modest in Washington State, but that's going to change very quickly because of the policies that we have in place in Washington. I've been speaking recently with the executive or the former executive director of PACE Nation, and he keeps saying that Washington is the vanguard, Washington is the vanguard because of the policies that we have in place, performance standards and new building codes. So we're going to see an explosion of PACE financing in the coming years. And this will turn into a leading market very quickly. And that makes me wonder, are we going to regret taking those shortcuts in 2020 and delegating responsibility of the PACE program to the county level? I think when we see a large volume of transactions happening, we're going to wish we had a state program, but more importantly, we're going to wish we had a third-party statewide program administrator. I think that is something really critical, and hopefully we could change that at some point.
Well, thank you. I guess that definitely leaves some room for us to go statewide, and with the continued action we're seeing at the legislature with the building performance standards, it would be nice to see that go across the whole state.
The good thing is that the 7 counties that do have active programs are really the most populous ones and have most of the commercial buildings in them. So King, Pierce, Snohomish, Thurston, Whatcom, Clark, Spokane. But I agree with John, we need to get all counties signed up so that business owners can take advantage of it, building owners can take advantage of it.
Well, that's definitely what I'm hearing too, is that in the major metros, I-5 corridor in Spokane, that's where the core action is happening from a building performance standard and our building stock regulations. So, well, John, maybe could ask you a little bit. Can you talk about Kitsap Bank's role in the CPACE finance process?
Yeah, so Kitsap Bank is a privately held, women-owned community bank headquartered in Port Orchard. We've been serving the greater Puget Sound region since 1908, and our core competency is definitely commercial real estate. And so CPACE aligns really nicely with that core competency, but more importantly, it aligns with the values of the bank and the commitments that our team have made to investing in projects that have a positive impact on the climate. Our team manages a portfolio of utility scale solar projects. And we're also really excited to be growing our CPACER portfolio, in part because we had a pretty outsized influence on the passage of the legislation and contributed heavily to the language that was formally adopted, and then also pushed through an amendment, I think in the last legislative session, that made it easier to transact So we're excited to start transacting, and we hope our portfolio includes new construction projects, solar development, retrofits, resiliency upgrades, all the above. And for new construction, CPACE can be added to a construction loan, or it can be added to the permanent financing that's used to take out a construction loan. And because Kitsap Bank is a community bank, we can offer construction loan, permanent loans, and CPACE financing all together. So, it's a one-stop shop in that respect. And, if a group like Pace Equity came along and they had a project that they were going to be extending CPACE capital to for a new construction, but they needed a consenting senior lender, that's also a position that we'd be willing to step into. And I should probably add that, as a community bank, I think we're going to have a far greater appetite for smaller projects relative to some of the national PACE capital providers. I think our goal is to entertain projects below 100,000 at some point. We're not there yet, but we're trending toward that goal.
Thank you. Rachel, what about Pace Equity?
Yeah, so you're going to see, I think, a pretty wide gamut of providers, how Kitsap Bank and Pace Equity are different, yet we offer the same product. And I think that's great because the market needs all sorts of solutions, from small to large, local, national. So Pace Equity is a national leader in PACE financing. We are headquartered in Milwaukee, and that's where leadership and the support staff work. And then there are about 20 folks like myself in different areas nationally throughout the country. So my territory is Washington State. I also can look at projects in Oregon, where there's two counties, one coming online soon, that have PACE financing. So Pace Equity, we've been around since 2014 and have closed over 200 transactions with over 300 million, worth over 300 million, and catalyzed $1.5 billion in development throughout the country. So we're pretty experienced on that. What I think is special about Pace Equity and the reasons why I wanted to join the company. I've been with Pace Equity for just a couple months now, although I think you can tell from Steve's intro, I've been here in the community and in the industry for longer than I would like to count. What distinguishes Pace Equity is our end-to-end process. We really take care of the process to make it as easy as possible for the building owner. The building owner does not want to deal with any kind of financing paperwork and the hassle. You have to get an energy efficiency audit in order to satisfy the program. There's just a lot of steps, and it's complicated and it's a little wonky. So we really take that in-house and work to make the process as streamlined as possible and as fast as possible for the building owner. The other thing that I really was excited about in joining Pace Equity is we have what's called our Cirrus low carbon product. And that operates the same mechanism as regular PACE, but it is a lower cost of capital for lower carbon buildings. And so we can offer a slightly lower rate for buildings that meet the specification that we developed with the New Buildings Institute, which is a not-for-profit headquartered down in Portland that works to improve the efficiency in commercial buildings. And they're some real leaders in the field. So this spec is not, you do not have to be net zero. You do not have to be passive house. It is really nudges building construction and renovation along that spectrum. The really interesting thing is that for buildings in Seattle, particularly because of the strength of our building and energy codes here, getting to the Cirrus specification is not a huge lift. We have really strong building codes. I have colleagues in places like Ohio, and I'm not picking on Ohio, they just don't have as strong building codes, that meeting that Cirrus spec is a much bigger lift for those customers. So that's what's important, I think, to us, is that we're both doing the right thing from a climate perspective to really push the envelope on that, but also at the same time we're saving the building owner, developer, retrofit money, and that's what gives them the incentive too. So I really like how those incentives are aligned.
Awesome. So with that, why would a building owner want to use CPACE for a project rather than other kind of funding? What are the advantages?
It saves them money. So, you know, when this is not what I was going to say earlier, but I'll say it now. When I was at the county and was at King County, was setting up the PACE program. When I talked to anybody, I used words about climate and equity and economic development. A lot of times today, when I'm talking to real estate developers or building owners, I talk about return on investment. I talk about weighted average cost of capital. I talk about their internal rate of return. I talk about not having to take any money out of their pocket for retrofits. It's the same product, and that's what I really like. So what happens is in new construction, when someone goes out to build a new building, they've got to go get some debt, right, from a bank like Kitsap, for, let's say, 50% of their cost. They've got to come up with another 50%, and that's either going to be their equity, you know, their investment, or they're going to have to work with some mezzanine debt lenders, and those mezzanine lenders are usually just higher interest rate than we are. So we can come in, we can lend up to 20% of the loan to value, so 20% of the whole value for the improvements that I talked about, HVAC, electrical, envelope, all those things, at a lower rate and really long amortization up to the life of the equipment, so 25, 30 years, depending on what it is, so that their payments are much smaller. And they like that, right? They are not paying someone at the equity rate of mid-teens, they're paying us in more like sevens. So that's why they do it. From a retrofit perspective, if the numbers work out right, and let's say they've got a $10 million building and they've got a retrofit project that's less than 2 million, right, 20%, and let's just say all the other underwriting works out right, and I can go into detail on this if anybody wants to follow up later. I'm not going to bore everyone on this. We can fund that entire project with no money out of pocket, and so that takes away that barrier. So that's why building owners are interested in PACE, and that's why I think both John and I think there's a huge opportunity here, especially with you know, Clean Buildings Act and, you know, other compliance standards that are coming down.
Thanks. John, what are you hearing about that from folks you're talking to?
Yeah, I would just add, building off what she was saying, you know, the reason why it's less expensive in terms of issuance rates relative to like mezzanine debt is because it's awarded a senior lien. So in the capital stack, it sits above the senior lender. And in the event of foreclosure, and if the asset is liquidated, then you know, the CPACE capital provider gets paid first. And so our security position is very strong, and that allows us to extend fixed rates for up to 30 years. And yeah, I could talk about non-accelerating, but I think I would lose it. I was trying to think, I was like, can I describe non-accelerating in like 20 seconds? I can't, but basically it's a function where like senior lenders are willing to subordinate themselves in the capital stack because of the non-accelerating nature of CPACE capital. And also like it overcomes the split incentive, which is really important because it is classified as a tax assessment, a special assessment, and you can transfer those to the tenants in most lease arrangements.
John, I want to find split incentive for folks.
Yeah, split incentive. So the property owner, you know, invests in upgrades, but the tenants are the ones who reap the rewards through lower utility payments. So there's no incentive and no return for the property owner.
Thank you. So both in Seattle and Washington State, we have some kind of nationally leading building performance standards. Washington State, we have the statewide clean building performance standard. In Seattle, we have the currently draft Seattle building emissions performance standard. Could you talk a little bit about the Seattle owners needing to meet those compliance deadlines and how PACE can help?
Yeah, so I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with performance standards, and there's probably a few of you who could describe it way better than myself. But they govern emissions from existing buildings, and whether we're talking about Seattle's greenhouse gas intensity performance standard or Washington's energy use intensity standard. I think the end goal is kind of the same, to start marching buildings toward net zero by the midway point of this century through these 5-year cycles. So every 5 years, the standard becomes more stringent, the belt gets tighter, and properties that are on the wrong side of these standards are going to be exposed to fines. I haven't read Seattle's fine policy. I've tried to read Washington State's fine policy. If someone can explain to me how they calculate these fines, I'd be super grateful. I think they could really simplify that. But yeah, so like, because we're marching toward net zero, property owners are going to be forced to make deeper upgrades, and they're going to be looking to source financing in order to, make capital expenditures and such beyond just like commissioning the property. The enforcement periods begin in 2026 for tier 1 buildings. I'm kind of just speaking specifically to Washington right now because to keep things simple. And then tier 2 buildings are going to be brought into the fold in 2031, and that covers 20,000 square feet and above. And I was speaking with someone in Washington Commerce, and they said there's potentially over 100,000 tier 2 buildings in Washington. I don't know if that's correct, but if each of those buildings requires like $250,000 of capital in order to reach net zero, then we're talking about like $25 billion of capital that needs to be injected in covered existing buildings. And a lot of that is going to come from CPACE, I imagine. I guess too, we could talk about new construction. So building codes. Washington passed these awesome building codes, and now commercial and multifamily residential properties have to be installed with electric, space, and water heating equipment. And so right away, they qualify for CPACE automatically because of that. They can all take advantage of CPACE. They can all use CPACE in their capital stack for up to 30% of total eligible costs. And as Rachel was describing, that's going to lower their weighted average cost of capital by supplanting mezzanine debt and equity. So there's a lot of applications, both in new construction and existing buildings, and the regulations we have here are going to drive a frenzy of investment activity, and there's going to be a surge in demand for CPACE financing.
Well, Rachel, how would somebody get started? How would an owner or developer get started?
Call me. No, that's seriously, that's my role. You know how it is complex, and part of the value that we as PACE lenders provide is that assistance to go through the process. So there's a couple different things to do. One, you need to look at what is the program, and since we'll just talk about Seattle here, right? What does the King County program look like? I happen to know that program, but we need to figure out, is the project that you're talking about, is that going to qualify to go through the program? So that's the first thing. Is it efficiency? Is it seismic? What is it? Is the King County program administrator going to sign off that this is an applicable CPACE project? The next is to really run some high level numbers and look at your project. And to do that, I would need a couple financial statements from the project. I would need a construction budget. I would need a pro forma so I could see what the cash flow is and look at how that would cover the existing debt and our assessment. And I would need to look at the capital stack. What are the other components in the building, whether it's existing or new construction? So once you pull those together, I can run a couple models and get an idea of what we could do for the property owner. Then from there, let's say we can put together a $2 million deal. I would issue what's called a term sheet, which is really the start of the negotiations with and negotiations is maybe too strong of a word, but start the dialogue with the building owner. Is this what you were thinking? Is this about the size of the debt you were thinking? Is this about the size, the funding? Is our timing good? Is your prepayment what you want? Just a lot of those kind of just technical details to make sure that we're getting a solution that works for the building owner. Everything looks good. We would then do some more underwriting, and then we would issue what's called, a commitment letter. And at that point, we at Pace Equity will commit to fund, assuming there's still lots of things to do, but we've made the credit decision that that's how we would want to go. Do an energy audit kind of in the middle of that. And then a couple other steps kind of in the background to get to closing. And this can take, a while, but it can also, if everything kind of lines up quickly, you can close in 90 days. Sometimes it usually takes a little bit longer just to get the required material, but that's kind of the full process. But I always tell people, everyone I meet I talk about PACE financing, just give me a call. Like, it doesn't have to be something formal, call and say, hey, I've got the kind of this thing that I'm looking at, would this work? And, pretty quickly, I can do kind of a back of the envelope and see if that's something that has legs and that we should, talk more about.
Thank you. John, anything else on the process, or you want to talk more about into other incentives and opportunity?
No, I think our process is pretty comparable. They're pretty consistent across capital providers. It's interesting to compare markets. So now we're starting to transact in like Colorado, where this is a theme for me tonight, where there's a third-party program administrator for the whole state, and they take on a more hands-on approach in terms of giving guidance to the property owner and engaging them early on in the process and kind of holding their hand throughout. And I don't think counties necessarily play that role here. And so there's more of a burden on service providers to step up and provide those services. Although I think the market would perform better in Washington if there was this linchpin, if there was this statewide third-party administrator who was highly sophisticated and specialized in CPACE, and that we don't have that. So
yeah, I'll just second that. City and county staff, this is probably one of many things that they're doing, and this could be allocated to a sustainability department or economic development department. And they're not experts. And I say that when I set up the PACE program, I was not an expert on that. So John's right. There's a lot of steps and there's some complexity in there, but it makes our job to make it easier for the building owner, right? Because the more hassle it is, and the more money you have to pay, those are both two big headwinds to doing any project. And so we try to smooth those out as much as we can.
yeah, I'm helping Jefferson County, as you may have heard in my intro, launch a CPACE program, and it's this tiny county across the Puget Sound, and they would never do this if I wasn't available to help them out. And so it's kind of inequitable that CPACE is made available in like places like King County, where there's greater resources to support the launch of the program. Whereas, a lot of the other counties don't have the wherewithal to do it, and therefore, their constituents don't have access to this really important tool that's going to make it easier for property owners and developers to comply with these regulations that cut across the whole state.
Well, I have one more question. In order to get these ambitious projects done, we often have to combine other incentives and other programs. I'm hoping each of you could talk about some of those incentive programs and how CPACE can tie in or fit in with those programs.
Yeah, I can start out. Our, PACE Equity, we've done a lot of projects with tax increment financing and historic tax credits and opportunity zone investments or incentives, excuse me. That's, those are very popular, particularly in areas that need to grow their economic base, and PACE funding is perfect for that. So it just makes the little pancake of stacks in the building more complex, but that's where our experienced team really shines in that case. We have that back office capability to do that. And, some of those phone calls get big with a bunch of parties and sometimes attorneys. You don't want too many attorneys on the phone because that gets to be an expensive call pretty fast. But that's especially when it's a really good project and you've got a really strong sponsor who building owner saying, I really need all this capital cobbled together to make this project work. And that's when you take some extra work, but it's good to get to that outcome and finally get the building ready to be retrofit or rebuilt or built.
Well, John, and I know we have some big federal legislation.
Yeah.
You want to talk about any of that?
Yeah, I can talk about that. There are a lot of incentives now at the federal level, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. I guess some of them existed prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, but they've been beefed up. And they align very closely with the projects that qualify for C-PACE financing. I think I've identified 4. Let's see if I can remember the tax codes. You have Section 48 investment tax credits for solar. You have the 179D tax deduction for energy efficiency in commercial buildings. Although I did an Excel calculation and it's not as large as people think. It's really accelerated depreciation and just a time value of money calculation, as I've learned from someone in Daniel's network. You have 30C, which I think is a tax credit for charging stations and fueling stations. And you have 45L, which is a tax credit for new construction, energy efficient new construction in the residential space, which also applies to multifamily properties. And then at the state level, there's the early adopter incentive for properties that comply early ahead of schedule with the Clean Building Performance Standard. And then there's a whole slew of utility incentives. I guess, the one thing that they all share in common is they're monetized on the back end of deals after close. And so they don't necessarily impact the terms of the loan and the payment structure. I guess a property owner could anticipate the monetization of certain incentives and elect to take on a smaller percentage within the loan relative to the cost of the project. But yeah, they're monetized on the back end of these deals. And so I think that's a common mistake that people think.
Well, thank you. Great answers. I'm betting there might be a few questions from the audience. If anybody in the audience had a question, you could either pass those and drop them to Sheila. Or if anybody wants to, you could stand up and ask.
One of the challenges that we've heard from other PACE financiers is that there's a little bit of a challenge trying to get some senior lenders to sign off on like allowing a debt holder or a developer or whoever to actually take advantage of this. And I know that sometimes there's a little bit of massaging of those relationships to try and make it so that they do that. I know, John, you've done some communicating with senior lenders to try and make them more comfortable with the adoption of this debt. Can I ask like how that's going and how, are our senior lenders becoming more, are they becoming more cool with it? Are they willing to let you take advantage of it?
Well, I don't know if I'd want to say take advantage in the question, but years ago, what we call lender consent was a big deal. And PACE is really new here in Washington. So there's a lot of education of lenders that what John and I are working on. It's much more mature in other parts of the country. So but it used to be new to everyone, and it was a bigger deal. But last year, depending on who you listen to, there was over $1 billion worth of PACE financing nationally. So clearly lenders are letting $1 billion of PACE financing, so they're consenting to that. I think what we see is once lenders, when you have that conversation, whether it's proactively, I'm out meeting with bankers in the region, I'm sure John is too, or when you're at the table for a deal, once they kind of understand the benefits to their client and your client, which is, better cash flow because of the efficient building, increased asset value because now they've got some really high performance equipment in it. Once they understand, okay, there's these benefits, and then you can help them understand that their risk is actually minimized. And John touched on it a little bit. It's about that non-accelerating, right? That how much of the funding in front of them would actually come due if in the case of foreclosure, which doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. So once they get comfortable with it, we've been really successful at Pace Equity, getting lenders comfortable with it. But you're right, it is nice to work with lenders that are familiar with it and have consented to it before.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, it's easier during the development process, she was saying, because you're all sitting at the same table. And in Washington, it should be an easier sell because we have these performance standards and these fines. And as Rachel was mentioning, we don't want to impair the NOI, the cash flow of the property. And if you can help the property owner avoid fines, that's going to be in the interest of senior lenders. I guess I could try to explain non-accelerating, but so imagine like two capital stacks. So like at the project level, maybe CPACE takes up 20% of the property value. This is when the project's happening. And then let's imagine a project forecloses. In this scenario, CPACE only takes up about 1% of the capital stack because it's non-accelerating. You only have to pay out that year's worth of payments to the CPACE capital provider. You don't have to retire the all outstanding principal because the lien transfers in the event of an ownership sale. So yeah, it's 20%. And then, when there's a foreclosure, it's only 1%. So 99% of the proceeds are still going to reach the senior lender. And I don't know, that's how I was thinking about it, but.
Great. Sheila, do you have a question from the audience or online?
I'm gonna attempt to unmute if it
Makes noise. Okay, are we good? Okay. Yes, I have a question. What if a building's owner uses CPACER to finance a building component upgrade and later they want to do an additional eligible upgrade? Are there limits on reapplying to the program?
Well, so that brings up one point that I don't think we've talked about is that, yes, it can be used for new construction and retrofits, but in King County, you can look back 3 years. So if you've worked with a customer that did a retrofit in the past 3 years, we can look at them for PACE financing. But in that particular case, I think that there would need to be two different transactions. So the first transaction, whenever that happened, and then a couple of years later, there would need to be a second transaction.
And that's a pretty realistic scenario if you think about just the nature of
Yeah.
performance standards. Maybe property owners do kind of take like a piecemeal approach versus just knocking everything out in one fell swoop.
Anybody else? Anybody? John has a question? You want to come up to the owl, sir? Go ahead. Unmuted.
Okay.
I had a question about the counties that are not involved in this. You talked a bit about focusing in King County and you're in Jefferson County. What is it? What type of work is being done to spread the word, and what needs to happen for that for all of the counties in Washington State to take advantage of this?
Great question. I think I'm always talking to people. So it's events like this. It's reaching out to business owners in different counties. So for example, I'm talking to somebody that has a project in Kitsap County, actually. We should probably talk about Kitsap County. And the process there would be if they're interested in it, let's see where the program is. If we don't know, I'll make some phone calls to figure out, I'll talk to the sustainability person, the economic development person, kind of find out where they are. If they don't have anything, that's an opportunity for both me as a capital provider, but really more importantly, the business owner to appeal to their county commission or their county council and say, hey, I'm a resident and business owner in your district, in this county, and I'd like to have this program so that I could save money. That's going to be a really strong voice and a really strong argument. Thankfully, John touched on this a little bit. If you recall, you mentioned that Commerce had their funding had been cut to run a statewide program. A not-for-profit here in Seattle called Shift Zero. If you guys are familiar with them, they're really focused on net zero buildings. They took up the slack actually after that funding was cut and gathered stakeholders, practitioners. They got some free legal help to set up a program. And so they've got a template program guide and legal documents that you can use. And when I was at the county, that's what I used. There was no need to reinvent the wheel. And so most counties have adopted that pretty closely. There's little nuances in each one. So it's not like a county would have to, write it from scratch. There's materials there for them. But I don't want to belittle the amount of work it would take to think about how you're going to staff it, how you're going to operate it. And, getting legislation through, a county council or commission is never a small task.
So there's
But it's totally doable.
there's legislation that needs to happen at the county level.
Yeah, the county council or commission needs to approve, needs to authorize staff and specifically the recorder and assessor's offices to record that lien and to set up a program. So kind of two things. But again, there's templates out there for that for a county to do. It's just some inertia, frankly.
John, you want to give it, you want to share any blow by blows in
Yeah,
Jefferson County?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated and, setting up the program is probably easier than implementing it. Counties are the first people fielding questions. So in some respects, they have to become like subject matter experts. And as you guys are hearing, like this is pretty esoteric stuff and a lot of county workers are going to be reluctant to invest the time and energy that's required to successfully operate the CPACE program. My team at the bank is like, I don't know if this is realistic or not, but we keep talking about like, we need a statewide program. And more importantly, we need a statewide program administrator. I think that's so important. I don't know if it's going to happen, but like, if we aspire to be a leader in building decarbonization, we need that infrastructure in place that can move as much capital as possible with the least amount of friction. Like, I don't know how we're going to be like a leader in the market with like a very suboptimal program framework. It just doesn't seem to reconcile in my mind.
Thank you. Well, Laura, did you have a question or you just?
I have a question.
All right, I think Laura had a question, if you don't mind, Laura.
You want to come over?
Hang on, I gotta talk to you.
On a residential PACE program, how would you guys be involved with residential side? Or do you know?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Yeah, I don't think like the juice is worth the squeeze.
Okay.
And as I was saying, like with the program administrator, I just think it's just too high of transaction costs given our current program framework to manage residential PACE. Especially, these are less sophisticated homeowners versus commercial property owners. The projects are smaller and, you need consumer protections in place. That's administrative burden and doing that at the county level, it just seems unrealistic.
Yeah, I think, for those that don't know, residential PACE would be for single families or townhome retrofits, which is, we need some mechanism for that. That is, really kind of the holy grail of energy efficiency. But in California, residential PACE is allowed and is enabled in 3 states, California, Missouri, and Florida. And it has not been a great experience. There has been a lot of fraud, lack of transparency, lack of consumer protection, and frankly, just some bad actors. And so it's resulted in some, really negative financial impacts to really unsuspecting and well-meaning people. And that's the type of thing we need to, that's a huge lift to make sure that we're protecting people here. And so I don't know if it's going to go anywhere. So, but I'm curious to see.
And one more question.
And I don't need to know actual numbers, but I'm curious what the rates would be with the Kitsap versus the rates with the PACE equity.
For like,
A $10 million commercial loan. I'm just curious, like, where's the? Like, is it a program?
Change every day.
So
Yeah.
similar to like home ownership, home.
Yeah, it's a spread above a certain index, so it kind of depends on the term of the loan. But I think ours is like 2.5%, 3% above a certain index, whatever.
Sure.
That percentage is when the contract is signed, and they're probably similar, maybe a little lower.
Yeah, I mean, we price off the 10-year treasury, which floats every day. I mean, right now, some of our rates are, 7 to 7.5.
Think we have time for one more. Warren, you got a question?
Yeah.
We gotta get you to talk to Al.
To build on the same thing that you were talking about as far as state oversight and guidance, I was gonna ask, what do you think are the greatest barriers to developing that state review board like you see in Colorado here in Washington?
Well, we've kind of already journeyed down this path of county level program administration. And so are we willing to do an about face and invest the time in correcting course? I think it's worth it. Again, I really do, because we're going to be so reliant on CPACE capital to finance billions of dollars of upgrades in Washington. And it just seems worth the time and energy to get that framework as sharp as possible. There might be some political resistance, but I can assure you, like, I don't think the counties would lose any sleep over getting stripped of their administrative duties. Maybe Rachel, you could offer some insight there.
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. Where as a capital provider, I have a completely different perspective than I did 6 months ago. As a capital provider, we like consistency in programs. So when the programs are all a little bit different, that just makes it a little bit harder. And consistency is good for building owners too, right? They don't want to think about, oh, well, Pierce County is just a little bit different than King County, right? Because a lot of big developers are in both counties. So I think that would be a definite plus, but I kind of wonder, cat's kind of out of the bag at this point. It would be a lift to kind of, stuff it back in and go to a different structure. And then there's a question of, how's that get funded? Is that at state level? I mean, there's just some questions on there. So I don't want to belittle the challenge that it would take, but I could definitely see the benefits of it.
Our team is moving in that direction. We're trying to beat that drum and get it fixed. I don't know if it's possible, but we're going to try.
Well, I think we're kind of closing up on time. So ask for some parting thoughts, but I think we'll stick around afterwards if you have individual questions. So John, any wrap up comments?
Yeah, I just wrote some things down. I figured I'd read it. All right, let's see if I can read into a mic. Is this thing even on? Has this even been on the whole time? No. All right. Access to financing and private capital is of the greatest importance if we hope to scale clean tech adoption and reach our climate goals. Public incentives within the IRA are not a force, but rather a force multiplier. Private capital is the force. Number two, even though CPACE has been around since 2008, Washington is brand new to this financing instrument, but we will soon become a leading market because of building codes and performance standards. We are all traveling along this learning curve together, and we will have to learn quickly. Number three, robust public-private partnerships are necessary to create a deep pipeline of properties and projects that are ready to receive capital. Data is king. Number four, This is kind of redundant. Our county level program framework may experience stress as the volume of CPACER transactions increases by orders of magnitude. We should explore the options of correcting course, installing a statewide program, and more importantly, creating a statewide third-party program administrator. If we want to be a leader in this market, we need to deploy as much capital as possible with the least amount of friction. Number 5, the workforce will not develop unless we deploy capital, and the capital won't be deployed unless we develop a workforce. Number 6, don't wait around, act sooner rather than later.
Well, Rachel, can you follow that?
Alright. Should have gone first. Wow. You know, we've given you a lot of information tonight, and I know this is kind of a complicated and wonky topic. Try to not use any acronyms. I'm not sure if I've been successful on that. You know, what I would just say, you are all now PACE ambassadors. You know more than a lot of people about it, right? And you're probably gonna go home and forget most of it, but that's okay. If anything, you know, once you just remember that it saves the client money, it's good for the environment, and it's an economic development tool. And so those are the really important things to think about it. And then if you have questions and need resources, you can Google things, and the King County website, PACE website, has a lot of resources. It's got John's really awesome videos.
Yeah, check out those videos.
Or you know, you can call one of us and talk about any kind of prospective project or how to identify them better and be a better resource for your customers. So thanks again for all your questions, and thanks for listening.
Thank you both for taking the time to talk with us this evening. Thanks everybody for attending, and Daniel for the Settle 2030 district. We have a number of students here as well, so we're trying to live it with the workforce. And folks, some time for networking. Please take a bite, take a sandwich, hang out for a little bit. Thank you so much for attending.
Is there anything that he's gonna do? Is there any project this is going to do? Standard. Reduce their EY, and would now be eligible.